7 million dead, countless lives ruined, but 5 years later, the world is still asking how did this happen and who is responsible? As a foreign news reporter for The Sun, I've watched as claims about COVID's origins, once widely dismissed as conspiracy theories and pseudoscience, have gone mainstream. Now, I want to discover why it's taken so long for the lab leak theory and those who sounded the alarm from the start to be taken seriously. So, I went to find them. US officials who were in the White House as COVID took hold.
This is not natural. This was orchestrated.
Investigators with access to classified information.
This is the biggest intelligence failure in the history of the world. I mean, Watergate was nothing.
And the ordinary citizens who stepped up to uncover the truth.
This is the worst example of biomedical malpractice in the history of human existence.
To ask why the highest levels of the US government may want the true origins of COVID to remain a secret.
One person's conspiracy is another person's strategy.
At the end of 2019, there were very few people who understood the magnitude of what the world was facing. One of them was Robert Redfield, the director of the US Centers for Disease Control. It was his job to prepare the US for the onslaught that was coming.
When I became first aware of the outbreak was on New Year's Eve, 2019. I was pretty confident from the beginning that we were in for a problem, that this was going to end up being a significant epidemic, maybe a pandemic. The US CDC also has an office in Beijing, and my team there told me about 27 new cases of a new respiratory illness that was undefined, that wasn't flu, and it wasn't SARS.
I was looking at it very early on too, because I heard from a number of sources, people I know in China who are in medicine, that they thought there was this colossal revival of SARS going on.
David Asher has spent decades rubbing shoulders with the most powerful people on Capitol Hill. As an investigator, he's worked on some of the US government's most classified intelligence operations.
I've been inside and outside of the US government 7 times, worked for 4 secretaries of state, different parts of the intelligence community, and I've worked for 5 of the largest hedge funds in the world as a strategist in biotech, which is an area that gave me some interest in COVID-19 as it emerged. I'm not a whistleblower. I can only talk about what I saw as an investigator. And what I saw was just patently outrageous. Understand, the Department of State has thousands of sources in China. These are not spies. These are Chinese officials. These are Chinese citizens. They're good people. What we're hearing consistently, that there's something really odd about this emerging pandemic. We didn't have a classified capability in Wuhan, but we had plenty of cables, and I don't know why those cables haven't seen the light of day. But the cables indicated there was this huge influenza surge. This ILI, influenza-like illness, started spreading quite rapidly, which was a clear indication, whether you are a spook or not, something was wrong with this influenza-like illness that was not influenza. As soon as I saw the cables on that from our embassy, I started calling people, including my colleagues in the Secretary's office, and said, I think we got to look into this.
I talked to my counterpart, George Gao, in China, who ran the Chinese CDC. George told me pretty quickly that he didn't feel there was any evidence of human-to-human transmission, and they didn't think that there was asymptomatic illness. I said, George, what's your case definition? And he said, Bob, it's someone with an unspecified pneumonia that's not flu or not SARS that came from the wet market. And I said, well, George, then by definition, everybody came from the wet market, because you're only looking at people from the wet market. So I said, you have to go outside the wet market. 2 or 3 days later, he called me back, and he said, Bob, we have hundreds of cases, and it has nothing to do with the wet market. I've offered to put a team in from CDC. I had over 20 people lined up to go. My counterpart, George, he said he couldn't give me approval. And then I went to ask President Trump if he would call the President of China, which he did. I was there in the Oval Office. But we never got an answer on any of our requests.
We had conclusively seen evidence that as early as mid-November 2019, the Chinese Communist Party was engaged in a frenzied cover-up of something going on in Wuhan, China. And the information all was consistent with a huge surge of activity involving some national security incident. Something was going on in the Imperial City that was keeping Xi Jinping up late at night that we didn't know about.
could tell George's personality changed in his interactions with me. I do think after the second week of January ongoing, I don't think we had a private conversation. I think he felt limited in what he could say to me.
About the origins
Not
of
everything.
this virus?
I would say the conversation we had by the second week of January was very different than any conversation I'd ever had with him over the years. If we'd gotten in, I would have learned probably within a week that this virus was very human-to-human transmissible.
It's likely they didn't let you go because you would have realized that quite quickly.
I think they already knew that, right? And they knew that. They're scientists and they're doctors.
They knew it was ready-made for humans.
No, they knew, well, some people probably knew that, in my view. They knew it was highly infectious for humans. You know, you go back and look at remember the pictures of them building the 25,000 person hospitals. They quarantined 11 million people in a city. They did that because they understood this was a big problem.
One of my friends who is one of the most famous biologists in U.S. national security, whose name I won't quote, I asked him, I said, what's your read on what's going on in China? And he says, it's a meltdown. It's like Chernobyl, except it's biology. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that this thing looks supernatural. The only question is, how did it get into nature? And that's where my investigation focused.
In a secret location in the United States, I'm meeting a Chinese whistleblower who fled the country after claiming the CCP hid the truth about COVID from the start.
When the outbreak happened, I was secretly appointed by my supervisor to conduct a secret investigation on COVID-19. At that time, China government rejected to give any information to WHO, even not to Hong Kong government. So they need to know what happened in China. What is the novel virus there? We are based in Hong Kong. If there are some new infectious disease happen in China, it's our responsibility. It's also something we need to prepare for. He said, you have to do it secretly and be careful. Don't cross the red line. Keep quiet. If not, you will be disappeared. I can't help you.
Dr. Yan was working at the World Health Organization lab in Hong Kong. She claims she had an extensive network of contacts inside China.
My friends told me that there are some basic facts we can know. First, there's COVID-19 virus sequence already. China knows that. Remember, at that time, even after 2 weeks until middle January, China didn't release the correct virus sequence. And also what China government know is in Wuhan, it's much worse than what they admitted. I feed back the information to them that China covered up what happened in Wuhan, and that was the novel coronavirus in Wuhan.
After uncovering what she believes to be evidence of the true origin of COVID, Yan decided to go public through an exiled activist and YouTuber living in America called Luda Media.
I thought when Mr. Luda broadcasted what I found, China government will realize, oh, our secret are exposed, we should stop.
After blowing the whistle, she says she began to fear for her safety in Hong Kong.
One day, Mr. Luda suddenly called me in the morning, said, you need to make the decision now. Either try to escape to the United States to tell people what you know about the virus, I will help you, or you would be found out by CCP. Means I already get identified, but they will finally get me and disappear me because he received some information from his sources. After 2 weeks, after suffering a lot, I managed to escape to the United States successfully.
Back in 2020, Yan's claims appeared hard to believe for many. She was widely criticised for claiming the virus did not have a natural origin. But Yan wasn't the only one with concerns about where it came from. A small group of journalists and campaigners also had their suspicions about the official story.
I'm an investigative reporter. We use Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain documents about the origins of COVID.
Sifting through mountains of documents, they uncovered some curious facts about what had been happening in Wuhan.
I've gotten COVID a couple times, and the thing that made me angriest while I was writhing in pain and sick in bed was the fact that there are individuals responsible for this.
Before the pandemic, there were a very limited number of laboratories in the world working on coronaviruses. One of the largest was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a sprawling complex located just 40 minutes from the city's now infamous wet market.
The CCP had big ambitions in biotech, and those ambitions were concentrated in the city of Wuhan.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology is one of China's leading virology institutes, in fact, probably the leading one. That institute was leading the search for the origin of SARS, the pandemic that broke out in 2002-03. And they were very successful in that. They tracked it down to bats, and they tracked it down to bats in particular caves in southern Yunnan.
The lab had sort of become internationally famous for discovering the key components that made up the original SARS virus, and they were looking towards the future.
Led by a Chinese scientist named Dr. Shi Zhengli, the Wuhan team scoured China's provinces hunting for SARS-like viruses in the wild, which could pose a risk to humanity in the future.
They were interested in something like SARS 2.0. So they were doing a lot of prospecting for these novel SARS-like coronaviruses in caves in southern China, in remote areas, and bringing it back to the city of Wuhan.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology was a good lab. It was doing world-beating research. It was doing it partly, as so often with Chinese labs, by collaborating with Western laboratories, learning the techniques, and then getting good at it themselves. Nothing wrong with that, but particularly the collaboration with Ralph Barick's lab at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill gave them the ability to do what they call reverse genetics, where you reconstruct a virus from its genes rather than isolating it from a biological sample in a bat, for example. Ralph Barick is probably the leading coronavirus researcher in the world in terms of his ability to sequence, manipulate, understand, and alter coronaviruses. And this was a little bit of a backwater until the SARS epidemic of 2002 and the MERS epidemic of 2012, after which coronaviruses became a hot topic. And the Barick lab became very important, really, in the world in its ability to get to understand what made these viruses infectious or dangerous, and to manipulate them in ways that shed light on their functions. But it's worth noting that he did not have access to SARS-like viruses directly, because they only live in horseshoe bats, which don't live in the Americas. And so his collaboration with Wuhan was partly about getting access for him to a diverse supply of SARS-like viruses. So you had very much a collaboration that helped both sides here.
In the Wuhan lab, Dr. Shi and her team experimented on some of their newly discovered viruses, souping them up to make them more virulent or deadly using methods known as gain-of-function virology.
Gain-of-function refers to when you take a virus and you give it a new trait, a new feature that enables it to be more infectious or more dangerous. That's basically all we mean by gain-of-function.
The premise is that if you do this, that you can more effectively develop therapeutics and vaccines.
In the US in 2014, a federal pause on funding for certain types of gain-of-function research was introduced, meaning no US government money could be used to fund research like what was being undertaken in Wuhan. In 2017, the pause was lifted.
There wasn't a huge pressure from scientists saying we need to lift it. I think it was partly because American researchers were concerned that because of the moratorium, some of this work was now going elsewhere, was now going to be done in China, for example.
Also interested in this field of coronavirus research were a New York-based non-profit with a mission statement to prevent pandemics, the EcoHealth Alliance, formerly run by Peter Daszak.
Peter Daszak is a British-born and educated zoologist who moved to the US and got involved in a wildlife charity and turned it into a wildlife disease charity.
They were more of a traditional kind of wildlife conservation and animal welfare organization, and then rebranded themselves as this kind of One Health pandemic prevention group when money really started to flow from the government to those type of projects.
Daszak collaborated with the Wuhan lab for more than a decade, even joining the team on virus hunting missions in China.
It was a very close relationship. There's lots of evidence that Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, and Shi Zhengli, the head of the key lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, were great friends. There's lots of pictures of them in labs together, there's lots of pictures of them collecting bats together, there's lots of exchanges about doing karaoke together. So this was a close relationship.
Every year, billions of dollars of US government money is dished out to various virus projects around the world. All of this money leaves a paper trail.
We follow the money wherever it leads. So we were reviewing this list of over 300 foreign laboratories that are eligible or actively receiving funding from the National Institutes of Health, and saw on this list the Wuhan Institute of Virology and started to connect the dots. Here we have this respiratory virus breaking out in the city of Wuhan. Here's the Wuhan Institute of Virology on this list of labs getting NIH money, and here are these papers they've been publishing about their collaborations with EcoHealth Alliance, where they were going into bat caves, collecting these novel coronaviruses, and then manipulating the laboratory to make them more dangerous to human beings. We brought that evidence to the White House, and after they didn't take action for a few months, we went public with it in April of 2020. Just since the pandemic began, they've received over $56 million in new taxpayer funding. Half of that has come from the Department of Defense, from accounts that are funding weapons of mass destruction related programs.
Despite receiving millions of dollars in funding to conduct research on coronaviruses, the lab's safety protocols were not up to US standards.
We also know from public records that they struggled with biosafety standards.
People working in the Wuhan lab were not wearing proper personal protective equipment, without proper protection, going into caves, capturing bats, bringing some of the bats back to the Wuhan lab, bringing samples back to the Wuhan lab.
There are 4 biosafety levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. BSL 4 is extremely cautious and safe, with immensely sophisticated methods of handling air and making sure that nothing can escape and nothing can infect anybody who's working in that lab. BSL 3 is pretty good, basically very good at making sure that no researcher can pick up a virus. BSL 2, on the other hand, is much easier. You don't have to wear a special suit. You don't really even have to wear a mask or gloves, but you probably do. You will work inside a cabinet probably, but not even necessarily that. So at BSL 2, if there's an infectious virus in the sample you're looking at, there's every chance you're going to get infected. If that virus is capable of infecting human beings, it is deeply inappropriate to work at BSL 2. Now we know that many of the experiments in the Wuhan Institute of Virology on bat-derived SARS-like coronaviruses were being done at BSL 2. The program of experiments that were going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology was into exactly the right kind of virus and doing exactly the right kind of experiments on them at exactly the wrong biosafety levels that you would expect if you were looking for evidence that it came out of a laboratory.
As the pandemic was spreading out of control in the United States, a Republican congressman in Ohio was also looking for clues about the origins of the virus. As a doctor, he tapped up his network of medics and unearthed an alarming experiment involving two of the scientists at the heart of the lab leak debate.
So just a little background for me, I'm a physician, I'm a soldier, I just retired from the Army, but I've been on the Intelligence Committee now for 10 years. When COVID started, when we started seeing people get sick, another doctor here in Ohio called me up and he said, hey, since we can't go in and see patients and do surgery right now, I've been doing research. I remember him sending me an article one day and he says, well, take a look at this. And he sends me an article from 2015, a published article from Dr. Ralph Baric in North Carolina and Dr. Zhengli Shi in Wuhan, China, where they created a super virus. They took parts of other viruses and made a virus.
One of the gain-of-function experiments that they did at the Wuhan Institute of Virology resulted in the creation of a virus which was 10,000 times more infectious. In other words, if you put it into a humanized mouse, the viral load in the mouse's cells was 10,000 times higher. That's a significant gain of function. Now, it doesn't mean that the virus is 10,000 times more lethal, but some of those viruses were also more dangerous to the mice they were infected into. They lost weight faster as well. And these aren't just mice. These are mice with human genes in them, human ACE2 receptors. So what you're doing here is you're saying, can we find a virus that is even better at killing mice with human cells in them? And if so, can we train this virus on getting even better at killing humanized mice? That can't be a sensible thing to be doing.
So it wasn't just about how are we going to treat people, but where did this come from? And how could this possibly come about? And oh my gosh, there's technology that we have, and apparently the Chinese have as well, that this can be created in a lab. So how can you not rule that out?
The laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology we're most interested in is Shi Zhengli's lab. That was the one that was working on these kind of viruses. But she wasn't doing all the work. She had a large number of people working for her.
The first intelligence the US government had that's credible about the origins of COVID-19 was the highly sensitive, highly specific intelligence related to workers falling sick in the lab that Dr. Shi ran. There's no doubt in hindsight, looking at unclassified information, including having spoken to multiple Chinese and foreigners who worked with the Wuhan Institute at the time and were in the Wuhan Institute, at least the old Wuhan Institute, that something happened at the new Wuhan Institute in the September-October period of 2019. What? I don't know. All the different indicators and warning signals we could see without having knowledge of what actually happened, all those boxes were being checked based on things we learned that were not classified, actually. And then came the classified information.
In the middle of September, 3 things happened in that laboratory. For some reason, they changed the command structure from the civilian command structure to a military command structure. The second thing they did was they deleted the database of the sequences that they had, which is highly irregular for scientists to delete years worth of work. And the third thing they did, and I think the most telling, is they put out a contract for a new ventilation system for that laboratory. And that's exactly when we started to see evidence now, also declassified, of new infections in the area of a respiratory tract-like illness that looked like flu but wasn't flu. I think that's when the pandemic started. I would say by mid-January, I was very confident there were 2 hypotheses. Spillover, which I thought was biologically less feasible because of how infectious this was in humans, and a laboratory link, which I thought was more feasible because of how infectious this was in human, and the laboratory had done research 6-7 years earlier trying to teach coronaviruses how to infect efficiently human tissue. I had many calls in January with Tedros, head of WHO, Jeremy Farrar, who was the Wellcome Foundation in the UK. Tony Fauci at NIH, saying that we had to approach both hypotheses aggressively, transparently, and to see if we had any scientific evidence that would support one versus the other. And unfortunately what happened is the scientists immediately coalesced around a single hypothesis.
There was a paper published in March 2020 called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which argued that it could not have possibly come out of a laboratory. It was very influential. It influenced me, for example. I went around saying, no, it couldn't have come out of a lab. They've proved it.
Within weeks, it had been read 3 million times, downloaded more than 5.7 million times, and cited in nearly 3,000 scientific papers.
I was told that I could attend a State Department briefing from Christian Andersen, Robert Gary, and they came to state through our intelligence bureau and provided a briefing on why this was absolutely natural and there was no reason to be suspicious. And that briefing occurred literally days, if not weeks, but not long after they had put out their initial draft of their paper on proximal origins.
Christian Andersen is emailing others saying, you know, I think it's still quite possible that it did come out of a lab. They thought a lab leak was actually friggin' likely, to use the words of Christian Andersen, the lead author. This is extraordinary.
In Washington, David Asher says he and his colleagues were met with cast iron assurances that it had come from nature.
We brought in the power centers inside the State Department. We had a number of meetings. And these experts, okay, most of whom I learned later on didn't know much about biological threats, but they had, good degrees in English and, in history from different nice universities. They were giving us unqualified, not just assurances that this came from nature, but that if we opened the file on what had happened, it would be a can of worms and it would explode in our faces. And then I started to get very suspicious. We weren't conspiracy theorists. I mean, I've been an investigator on a lot of big things, the Gambino crime family and the origins of the Islamic State and, Hezbollah narcotics trafficking in North Korea. And, a lot of times, you learn when you do an investigation, one person's conspiracy is another person's strategy. I'm talking about a conspiracy in our own government. I've not joked when I call it Wuhan Gate or Watergate of medicine. I mean, Watergate was nothing.
Investigators with access to US intelligence started to uncover what looked like the hallmarks of genetic manipulation in the virus.
When we started to receive analyses based on scientists who were highly cleared doing research, and they were like, well, it has so many different hallmarks of our own research. What we would do if we were going to create it from scratch, not knowing what it was, based on a SARS backbone, there would be certain steps that would be consistent with genetic alteration. And all of those boxes started to get checked.
We need to make sure that even today, the data sets that are available to every country.
So the smoking gun for me, early on, and when I say early on, I want to probably say March, I was sort of the virologist that Secretary of State Pompeo relied on in classified evaluations. He's asking me to explain what a furin cleavage site is. I told him then, I said, I think this is the evidence that this was created in the laboratory.
The SARS-CoV-2 virus that caused this pandemic was ready to infect people from the start. It was extremely infectious from the start. That's very unusual in a novel virus. Normally it has to evolve to be good at infecting people. One of the reasons for that is that it had in it a thing called a furin cleavage site in the middle of its spike gene, which made it much more infectious and much more capable of spreading in the lungs of people in particular. Now, that's unique. That's not been seen in any other SARS-like virus before. We've looked at over 800 SARS-like viruses now, and we've never seen a furin cleavage site.
What the furin cleavage site did was change the orientation of the COVID binding site for the H2 receptor, which is the human receptor, right? So normally it would go like this. Nothing would bind. It would bounce off. But the furin cleavage site would then change the orientation. So now the binding site went like this. And all of a sudden, in the presence of the furin cleavage site, the binding domain of the COVID virus fits perfectly into the binding domain of the receptor in the human cell, the ACE2 receptor. Right? Very purposeful. Now you ask the question, why does the COVID that came from bats no longer efficiently affect bats? Well, the reason is because they rechanged the orientation of the binding site so it infects humans.
We've never seen in nature anywhere a sarbecovirus, which is COVID-19 is, that has a furin cleavage site. But we know that the capability exists to insert a furin cleavage site.
For me as a virologist, the furin cleavage site is as close to a smoking gun as you need to go. This is not natural. This was orchestrated.
Worse than that, the furin cleavage site is an insertion. It's an addition to the genetic code of the virus. It's not a mutation. Now, it's very difficult for a virus to acquire a big addition like that, 12 nucleotides in length, unless it can do so by recombination with another virus that already has this thing. But we've not been able to find where it could have got that. So it was particularly extraordinary when in September 2021, a document was leaked, and that document, called the DFUSE proposal, very clearly stated that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in collaboration with the EcoHealth Alliance and a number of other bodies, were planning to insert furin cleavage sites into SARS-like coronaviruses for the first time. Now that's extraordinary. It's exactly what happened. A furin cleavage site was added to a SARS-like virus for the first time and caused a pandemic. Why would you not be suspicious of the fact that they were actually planning to do it for the first time?
The DFUSE proposal outlined gain-of-function virology that would have generated a virus that would have looked a lot like SARS-CoV-2. If the DFUSE proposal had been patented, SARS-CoV-2 would violate that patent. That is how closely the genome of the virus matches what is proposed in that grant. It's a blueprint, it's a recipe.
They proposed to change this virus so that it would bind to the ACE2 receptor, put in a furin cleavage site and do all this, and lo and behold, that's the virus that comes out. And that's a grant proposal that they put in a year before the COVID outbreak even happened. And if you know much about grants and scientists, you know, I did it for much of my life, most of us don't write grants that we don't already have data to know that what we're writing is going to work. I would say it is highly likely that they had already done the experiments before they even submitted the grant, that they knew that they could make this to work. And as others have said, there are lots of sources of funding outside of the US government in a DARPA grant. I think it's very highly probable that either they, EcoHealth Alliance, or their collaborators in the Wuhan laboratory were doing this kind of research. The virus that came out of it is pretty much the virus they describe in the research proposal. That's the virus that would cause the pandemic all around the world.
Some believe that the Chinese Communist Party has more nefarious interests in virology than they are letting on.
In 2005, our State Department said China's working on bioweapons, coronavirus bioweapons.
In 2011, at the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chinese actually made a declaration that they were basically pursuing a synthetic biological pathway for potential weapons development. And at the time, when I talked to people and who were there, they were like, yeah, it was shocking. It was almost like they were dropping a death card, you know, like in Apocalypse Now, you know, you mess with us, this is going to be happening to you.
Do you believe SARS-CoV-2 is a biological weapon?
It's a biological weapons-related capability. It wasn't released as a weapon. I mean, you know, they would have released it outside of, you know, the Pentagon if it was a weapon. But the idea that it could have been a lab accident involving the programs that they were running with reckless abandon absolutely highly confident of that. And so is that a weapon? Well, it's a weapon if it gets out.
There were also concerns about the close collaboration between American scientists and China's dual-use labs, where information is shared with the military.
You want to buy a weapon, you need to accumulate knowledge. You need to improve your technology. How could get that? That is the most important role of my lab based in Hong Kong, because many foreign overseas labs, when they have exchange or they have collaboration with mainland China laboratories, they may notice that, oh, this is a communist country and maybe that one is a military lab. But when they come to us, they feel, okay, this is Hong Kong, right? International. People in our team have very special opportunity to gain your knowledge, to get your materials. Also, even they can compromise you.
Dr. Yan says the transfer of knowledge from civil to military was more prominent at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
WIV looks like civilian lab. So they do a lot of emerging infectious disease project, not only coronavirus. And they go frequent international exchange with foreign experts. But actually that is just a stage. Behind them, whatever useful things goes to military. So WIV is the most important so-called civilian institute in China, but it is also one of the most important cover for CCP's military bioweapon study.
Dr. Yan says she has well-placed sources in China. We were unable to independently verify the truth of her claims, but we were able to verify other unrelated claims made by her. Many believe America should have done more to prevent the transfer of virus technology to China.
Let's face it, in China, there's really no private industry. Nothing is going on without the government knowing it. For me, coming from my background in the military and sitting on intelligence committee, concerned with our adversaries' bioweapons, my mind goes to that as well.
We looked at this from an arms control or lack of control standpoint, and all we saw was an absolute out-of-control situation involving a desperate dash, probably ordered from the Xi Jinping level on down, starting in 2017, to achieve some type of virus-like weapons capability that would be countered by something that we also saw present, which has to be present for you to assume that it could be a weapons vector credibly, and that's a vaccine. It was the vaccine program that I think some experts believe that might be the key to understanding what happened.
My view, it was research that was being done to create a vaccine vector. A vector, when I say if you're designing a vector, if I want to give you a vaccine, I could create a virus that I can insert the antigen that I want the virus to make, so you're immunized against that antigen. So I could actually create a virus that would infect you, but immunize you against polio. If it's a replication competent vector, I can infect you with that vector, and then you can go out and immunize another 100 people. And they immunize another 1,000 people. And all of a sudden now you have universal immunization against whatever pathogen you're going after. They wanted a vector that they could use to vaccinate the Chinese military, the Chinese people, and beyond. And that vector had to do a few things. First, it had to be highly infectious by a respiratory route. We don't have enough needles to inoculate everybody, okay? So they wanted a respiratory pathogen that was highly infectious. It needed to cause no illness, so it had to be asymptomatic. And it would be useful if it didn't cause long-term immunity, so the vector could be used over and over and over again for different antigens that they want to use to vaccinate the people with. I don't think it was an intentional program to create an infectious human pathogen. I think it was a laboratory accident that led to this vaccine vector, this virus, to then infect probably some of the lab workers, and they were infected asymptomatically. So then they went up and seeded the infection in Wuhan, and the rest is history.
So they made a mistake.
They made a mistake.
They underestimated the
Well,
transmissibility of this.
The word I like to use is they were arrogant. Arrogant. They didn't see this downside. Right? The scientific arrogance to think that nothing could go wrong, only everything could go right.
There's still no conclusive proof over how COVID exploded in Wuhan. What we do know is that there has been an astounding effort to suppress the lab leak theory, and the world is still searching for answers. With Trump as president and the CIA backing a lab leak, will the truth finally come out?
It should be a national level commission that makes the 9/11 Commission look like child's play. I mean, this is the biggest disaster to befall our nation since World War II, the Great Depression combined.
I've called for a moratorium on gain of function research. I think that we should have a broader societal debate about gain of function research. It shouldn't just be scientists. We should debate whether this research is of value. And if the general consensus of the world is that it's research that should be done, then we should argue about how can it be done in a safe, responsible and effective way. But right now this research is being done in university labs all over the world. The great pandemic is coming. It's going to be a bird flu pandemic, and it's going to be catastrophic. Unlike COVID that had maybe a 0.3% mortality, and particularly highlighted the vulnerable, the bird flu pandemic, when it happens, is going to have a 20 to 50% mortality. And it's not going to pick and choose between children and young adults. There's plenty of university labs that are playing around with this virus.
I do believe that we should stop all gain of function research. I think obviously the risk is tremendous, and the benefits don't outweigh the risk in my mind. And as we see the advent of artificial intelligence, we have the opportunity to be able to do more predictability about viruses through AI. And I've done several panels on this topic and talked to several experts on this topic. And I think that is a much safer way to go, where it's basically a computer scheme rather than a live virus that kills people.
Pretty famous now, Collins and Fauci wrote something in the Washington Post in 2012 supporting gain of function research. And they said that this is important research, and if the price of this is research that we have a pandemic, it's worth the price. Well, I would argue it's not worth the price.
I think it'll take political will, and I think it will take a public outcry. Maybe it'll take 20 years. I don't know. But I think the enormity of the pandemic kind of demands that we try. So we gotta try.